Morning, we're here, it's Thursday, October 3rd, and we're here with Bob Smith. And Bob, welcome, and what would you like to tell your family about who you were and who you are?
Well, I guess that means I ought to start somewhere at the beginning. I was born and raised in northern New Jersey. Two towns specifically outside of Newark, Nutley and Belleville. When I say Nutley, some people may, particularly ladies or women who might look at this, might recognize Nutley because Nutley had a famous citizen. Not the type of famous citizen that you would normally think of, but Nutley's famous citizen was Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart was born and raised in Nutley, New Jersey, in a blue-collar family of 7 kids. And she, depending upon what you think of Martha Stewart, she either went up or down from there. So, enough of that. I was born in the same hospital that my mother was. That was Orange Memorial Hospital in Orange, New Jersey, which is an Essex County neighbor of Nutley and Belleville. When I was 11 years old, the family moved from Nutley to Belleville. Belleville is the neighboring town to the south and an immediate suburb of Newark, New Jersey. My dad was a bus driver originally. My mother had been raised on a business out in eastern Long Island. Her father was 30 years older than her mother, and he ran the laundry for a New York City camp for underprivileged boys that was out on eastern Long Island. So obviously he died before my grandmother did because he was 30 years older than she was. And when that happened, she moved the family to Nutley, New Jersey, and opened a boarding house. So my mother and her sister and her brother, Billy, grew up in the food service industry, serving all the boarders in the boarding house. I had only one sister, actually 2. I had their oldest child, my parents' oldest child, died at birth. That would have been my older sister. So I was the spoiled man-child of the family, and my grandmother, that's my mother's mother, who grew up living with us, did all the cooking. So I got spoiled on homemade cherry pie and things like that. She just, the sun rose and set with me. I could do no wrong, and I think I really influenced and colored my sister's childhood as she grew up, my younger sister, which was unfortunate. But I lost my younger sister at age 54 to cancer, so I've been the only child in that family for a long time. I mentioned the fact my father was a bus driver. World War II came along. He went to work in what they called a defense factory in those days. He worked for a subsidiary of IT&T in Newark, New Jersey, making rectifiers, selenium rectifiers for military radios. My mother got the same job that he had. They were both forepersons or supervisors. He worked the night shift, she worked the day shift. And that went on for about 4 years. After the war, my father continued to work for the company for about another year, but then he fulfilled one of his lifelong dreams. He said, I can remember him telling me that he wanted to do one of three things in his life. He wanted to own a farm, he wanted to own a hardware store, and he wanted to own a gas station. So in 1947, he bought a little Sinclair gas station in Belleville, New Jersey. And I then worked for the next, let's see, I was 14 at the time. I worked for the next 7 years in gas stations and garages for my father. So that was an interesting upbringing, if you will. But I learned he taught me how to wash cars, particularly. He was a very persnickety guy when it came to washing customers' cars. So if you need to learn how to wash a car, come and see me. Let's see. So when I was 11 years old, I'll back up just a hair. At 11 years old, we moved from Nutley to Belleville. And that's where I went to high school. And I lived at home until I got through college. And I'll come to joining the Marine Corps in a minute. But I liked my first year at college at Rutgers University so well. And I was in what they called the Colleges for Men in New Brunswick at that time. I liked it so well that I failed every subject except Air Force ROTC. And therefore, I took it over again. So I went through college on the 5-year plan. And that's what really got me into the Marine Corps. In 1953, they were still drafting 50,000 men a month for service in the Korean War. And because I had lost my student deferment, having failed out of college in my first year, I came up eligible for the draft and received a pre-induction notice for physical. So by that time, I was in college again. I had transferred to the Rutgers University's Newark Colleges of Arts and Sciences, and was living at home. So I get this notice to report for my pre-induction physical. Well, by that time, I'd figured out I really wanted to be in college, so I didn't want to go into the Army. So I was scratching my head, what am I going to do? Well, I'm walking around the college campus, such as it was. The college campus in Newark, Newark Colleges of Arts and Sciences of Rutgers University consisted of a bunch of old buildings that the university had bought, including the old Ballantine Brewery, including an insurance building and a bunch of things like that. So I'm walking around the brewery, and under a stairwell in the back of the building, I see this bulletin board, and on the bulletin board is this old yellow copy of a flyer advertising the Marine Corps' Platoon Leaders Class program, which was the Marine Corps' equivalent of an ROTC. It was a college commissioning program for the Marine Corps. And I said, gee, I can do that. So it said, go see your college registrar. So I went to see a registrar, and it turns out the registrar is a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. That couldn't have worked out better. So he said, we're going to get you in the Marine Corps. So with his influence, we processed an application in 3 days. I went to New York City and raised my hand and swore myself in as a corporal in the Marine Corps Reserve. The next day was I went to the draft board. That was the day I was slated for the pre-induction physical. I went to the draft board and I had my Marine Corps ID card and I showed it to him and he said, "Well, good luck, son." And so I always called myself a draft dodger. And friends of mine say, "How can you call yourself a draft dodger? You went and spent 2 years at war." I said, "Well, I literally dodged the draft. And the Marine Corps was my salvation, if you will, from the draft." Anyway, we, let's see, let's skip on from there. I got through college, graduated in June of 1952, I guess it was. No, 1956, excuse me. In 1956. Had the summer off. I'm going to back up because an interesting part of things. I lived at home during the 4 years that I was at the Rutgers College, the North Colleges of Arts and Sciences, which was fortuitous for me. I paid my way through college, but my parents supported me and gave me a place to sleep, and my grandmother made sure I had plenty to eat. So that got me through college. I have worked a number of odd jobs of one kind or another, gas stations, garages, what else have you. One of my more interesting jobs was selling Catholic Bibles door to door for about 6 months. That was an interesting experience. These were big family Bibles that sold for $32 a piece, and they had their feature was 360 full color illustrations in the center of them. So I sustained myself doing that for a while, but finally I found a job working for a clothing store in Newark, New Jersey, McAvoy's Men's Shop, down in the corner of Market and Mulberry Streets. And it was owned by a Jewish family. Nicest people you'd ever want to run into. They really took good care of me for 2.5 years. And so after graduation, I spent 6 months, the first 6 weeks of that summer, finishing up working for the Albaums in McAvoy's Men's Shop, and then went on a 30-day driving trip across country with close friends of mine from college. He was married and was going to go to Cal Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, on a fellowship. So they invited me to drive cross country with them. We spent 30 days and drove 5,800 miles. That was a really interesting trip. And I used to have a photo album of that trip, which got lost in some move somewhere. Not an unusual circumstance. Let's see, in September of 1956, I reported to Quantico, Virginia, in my new set of uniforms with my bright shiny gold bars. Lieutenant Robert W. Smith reporting for duty, sir. So, basic school was an interesting experience. Every Marine officer who graduated from college went through the basic school, and in those days it was an 8-month course. we had gotten commissioned, but we had no idea how to be a Marine officer. So that's what basic school did. It taught you to be a Marine officer. So I came out of there very gung-ho. I really drank the Marine Corps' Kool-Aid. And I was ready to go. I got an infantry occupational specialty, and my first assignment was to the 1st Battalion, 9th Marine Regiment, which was headquartered in on the home island of Japan, on the slopes of Mount Fujiyama, a place called Mount Fuji Camps. So I got an interesting cross-country drive and an interesting trans-Pacific flight on a Navy C-97, all decked out for carrying passengers. And I had the delightful experience of sitting next to an admiral's daughter for a 24-hour flight across the Pacific. The Fuji camps, there were 3 of them, and a Marine regiment has 3 battalions, and each battalion was stationed at a different camp. My battalion, which was the 1st Battalion, was at North Camp Fuji, which is at the 3,800 foot level on the slopes of Mount Fujiyama. So every morning I'd walk out of the bachelor officer's quarters and turn to my right and look up, and there's Mount Fujiyama, just about like that. And in the wintertime, I got there in June. The regiment transferred to Okinawa in September. I stayed behind with the party that closed up the Fuji camps. So it was December before I moved to Okinawa. So by that time, the first snowfall had occurred in that part of Japan, and it was quite a brilliant, quite a beautiful sight to walk out of those quarters and look up at that mountain with the snow cap on it. Got to walk up it and walk back down it one day, which was another experience in itself. In any case, got down to Okinawa and spent another, 7 months, 13 months. We're supposed to come back in August of 1958. There was a disruption in Lebanon during the Eisenhower administration, and I got transferred into the 3rd Marine Regiment, and we mounted out, sailed down to Singapore, Hong Kong area. We were going to go across the Indian Ocean and up into the Gulf of Aqaba to block the back door into Kuwait. Because even in those days, they were concerned about those oil fields. In any case, we never got that far. Got as far as Subic Bay in the Philippines, and we waited there for a month, and then everybody turned around and went back to Okinawa. So I got a 14-month tour instead of a 13-month tour in the Far East. So I had orders to flight school. During the time on Okinawa, they kept rooming me with the battalion air officers, and they would take me flying. And flying was not something I really aimed to do. I thought I would be an infantry officer for my career, but I got flying around, and they got to working on me mentally, and and convinced me that if I didn't give it a try, I might regret it for the rest of my life. So I was able to pass the flight tests and wound up with a set of orders to Pensacola. Came back and got to Pensacola in October of 1958. Started flight school in January of 1959 when I actually started flying. I met my wife Gloria. Gloria had grown up in Pensacola as a child. Her father was in the Army Air Forces during World War II. Her mother was from Northwest Florida. And she had been dating friends of mine who were in flight school with me. There were 3 other Marines I was close to. And she dated all 3 of them. And then she dated me. And I drew the long straw. I was lucky. We were very compatible with one another. And so we met in January of what year did I say? 1950.
59.
59, I guess it was. Yeah, 1959. And we decided we'd get married. So the first opportunity that came along was Labor Day weekend. That's all I could get was 3-day weekend, and we got married in her parents' church, in the church that she went to, which was a Southern Baptist church, and over the Labor Day weekend. Let me back up a little bit, because my first date with Gloria was in a bowling alley. She was a bowler, and she was also, at 22 years of age, a bridge player, which is kind of unusual when you stop to think about it. Here's a 22-year-old single girl playing bridge. So I met her in the bowling alley, and a couple of months after that, we were bowling. So she's getting ready to throw a ball down the aisle, and so I sat there and I said, by the way, I said, would you be interested in marrying me when I get through flight school? And she immediately threw a gutter ball. So she said yes, and Labor Day weekend we were able to get married. So the other interesting thing that happened, our honeymoon was at the Grand Hotel in Point Clear, Alabama, on the shores of Mobile Bay. Beautiful resort, which is now owned by Marriott. So what are we doing? We're fishing. We're out on the dock fishing. And I catch a catfish. The catfish jumps up out of the water and sticks a stinger in my hand. My arm immediately swelled to my shoulder. Here we are in our honeymoon, and I'm under a doctor's care with my arm swollen up twice its size. We survived that somehow or another. We got through flight school, and our first assignment was to the Marine Corps Air Station in New River, North Carolina, where I joined a medium helicopter squadron and immediately deployed to the Caribbean for 6 weeks hardship tour. We were carrying a bunch of VIPs. The Department of Defense had arranged a big weapons demonstration for all of the military services of the Central and South American countries. which included a demonstration amphibious assault down off the island of Vieques in east of Puerto Rico, which was a major amphibious training base for the Marine Corps and the Navy. My squadron sent, how many was it, seven planes, 13 planes down there to provide the airlift for the VIPs. So we spent very little time ashore, flying those guys, and a lot of time ashore just enjoying ourselves and throughout the islands. So once that was over with, the next year we had our first child, Greg. Greg was born right after we left flight school. Yeah. He was born in Pensacola and never outlived the sand of Pensacola Beach. He always wanted to live in Florida, and I'll come back to that, but eventually he was able to do that. He had to go through a couple of wives and a career in the Fairfax County Police Department here in Virginia, but eventually moved to Florida, which is where he is now. He's retired in Tampa. So I expected to spend a good 3 years with that helicopter squadron on the East Coast, but after 2 years, I got a surprise set of orders that sent me to, of all places, to New York City. Now here's a Marine officer, pilot, hard charging, and with a set of orders to New York City, to the Marine Corps' Officer Selection Office, where I spent the next 2 years recruiting Marine officer candidates off the college campuses in the New York metropolitan area, lower New York State up about as far as West Point, upper New Jersey down to about as far as my old alma mater at Rutgers, and the state of Connecticut. So we lived in New Jersey, in Upper Montclair, maybe 3 or 4 miles from where I actually grew up as a kid. So it was a natural thing. I commuted back and forth to New York City every day, just like another businessman on a train and subways. So at the end of that tour of duty, which was in 1964, spring of 1964, I got orders to Marine Observation Squadron 6, which was co-located with the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton, California. So we jumped in the car. Oh, I gotta back up. We had our second child while we were I was on that OSO tour in New York City. That was Mike. Mike was born in Glen Ridge Memorial Hospital in New Jersey. I don't think he advertises that. I don't think that's something that's really that he's really necessarily proud of. In any case, I had orders I received orders in February with a detachment date of something like early March. And he was due to be born in February, and he was late. And he wouldn't come, and we had this cross-country trip coming up, so we were in a pretty big sweat. So Gloria went into the hospital, and they tried to induce induce the delivery, and he refused to come, so she went back home, and we sat around for another 3 weeks, and time was marching on, and time was getting short, and what else have you, and so she went back in, and they induced her a second time, and this time it took, and he was born. But we had a total of 5 weeks from his birth to having to report to California. So we went to Pensacola, and I left her, Gloria, with the 2 boys with her mother in Pensacola, and I drove cross country and found a house to live in Vista, California, and then they flew out. So here's Gloria. She's another brand new mother, and she's got a 5-week-old child on her hands, and she flew cross country with the 2 of them. And I met them in the airport in San Diego. In any case, VMO-6 was in the process of receiving the UH-1 helicopter to replace the old O-1 Bird Dog airplanes and the old H-43, or HOK as it was called, helicopter, which was a horrible machine. And when you looked at it, it had its rotor blades sat like this, and they intermeshed with one another. And of course, it was timed so the blades wouldn't hit one another, but it was just an awful machine to fly. Well, we got the H-1, and of course, by that time, we knew we were training to go to Vietnam. The VMO-6 was a feeder squadron for its sister squadron in the Far East, VMO-2. The Marine Corps had one other observation squadron, VMO-1, in New River, North Carolina, and also fed pilots and crews to VMO-2, which was headquartered and located in the Marine Corps Air Station in Futima on Okinawa, but had a detachment of O-1 Bird Dog aircraft in Vietnam for several years. I spent 10 months at Camp Pendleton. And our cadre with the UH-1s deployed to the Far East the following year in 1965. Because we were going to have to fly the O-1 in Vietnam for a while as we introduced the UH-1 into Vietnam. Some of us had not flown the O-1, so our cadre went to Okinawa, and those of us who had not flown the O-1 spent 30 days training in that aircraft, so we would be prepared to fly it in Vietnam. And then we climbed aboard we embarked aboard the USS Princeton, which was moving the 1st Marine Brigade from Hawaii to Vietnam, sailed by Okinawa and picked our cadre of UH-1s up, and we sailed on down to Vietnam. We got off the coast of Vietnam, and the Marine Corps was about to launch an amphibious assault. We called it an assault. And 50 miles south of its main operating base out at Da Nang, in a place called Chu Lai. That would be called Chu Lai. So I get the honor of flying the Marine Corps' commanding officer of that operation over the beach on D-Day on the amphibious assault. at Chulai. So everybody was a little bit nervous about that. So we fly in, and here the Vietnamese are ready to welcome us. I mean, you got the leaders of the country, you got all the ladies dressed out in their finery. They've got the welcome signs in both Vietnamese and in American there on the beach. And so here's our amphibious assault flying in. This guy, we laughed about that for a long time. In any case, we went back up to Da Nang and joined the goodly part of Marine Aircraft Group 16, which was operating off of alongside the air base at the airstrip at the runways, literally the runways at Da Nang Air Base. Our planes were parked in the sand right alongside the runway. The other side of the runway had Army helicopters and had all the fixed-wing aircraft, both Air Force flying north and Marines who were supporting the Marine activities around Da Nang. So it was a pretty noisy place day and night. You got so you could sleep through a lot of afterburners going on. So, that was an interesting experience. The Marine Corps, which had always been known for its close air support of ground operations, close air support by fixed-wing aircraft, had decided it really needed to arm some of helicopters to be able to provide some really close-in fire support of helilifts into much closer than the jets could get. So they had fabricated an armament kit for the UH-1, which consisted of a rack that could hold 4 M60 machine guns and rocket pods. Was designed at Quantico, was much lighter than the Army's system. We could never figure out why we didn't just go get the Army's gun system, which it had on the H-1s for a long time. But then we realized that we're the Marine Corps, so number one, we're going to do things our way, and number two, we're going to do it cheap. So we invented and developed our own gun kit, armament kit for the UH-1 helicopters. The unique part about that gun system was our gun sight consisted of an old-fashioned post and ring gun sight, which was mounted in the cockpit in front of the pilot, came down, and his armament, his alignment sight, his front sight, if you will, was a grease pencil mark on the windshield. Well, you'd be surprised how good you could get at shoot with that rudimentary gun sight and homemade armament system. We were not real popular with the Marine helicopters at first. The Army gun sight system on the H-1 was a mobile sight that was a mobile system which was operated by the co-pilot with a very sophisticated movable gun sight in his station, so that when he moved that gun sight, it moved his guns. So the Army flew very low and kind of ran around like this, and so anytime the Marine transport helicopters looked outside, you could see these Army gunships running around. Well, we had this fixed system. It was immobile and it was operated or fired by the pilot. So our tactics, if you will, were very much fixed wing tactics, which means you made a firing pass and you pulled up and went around in a racetrack pattern. And we could employ either 2 to 4 aircraft in that pattern. But as a result of that, the aircraft that we were supporting never saw us. We were always above them, and the only possible time they would see us is if we pulled off one of our firing runs. So they didn't feel like they were being supported by anything. So it took the transport helicopters a little while to get accustomed to the tactics that the Marine gunships had to employ. But VMO-2, or the VMO squadrons, were a very versatile squadron. They had a huge number of tasks assigned to them. So on any given day, we would employ those helicopters in a variety of missions. We could do medevac, we could do armed escort, we could do psychological warfare. We would make flights dropping leaflets. We had a sound system we could mount on the side, on the skids of the helicopter, fly over a village and broadcast to the village in Vietnamese. And since we had the nicest helicopters in Vietnam, we did all of the heavy VIP lifting. So when the Secretary of Defense or the commander of the military forces out of Saigon came up to a visit, we got to fly them. And I can recall one particular mission that was one of the more interesting ones, was when Secretary of Defense McNamara was scheduled to make a visit. And so we rehearsed this lift. The Marine Corps had really gotten into the capture the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, and we had almost a showpiece of a village outside of Da Nang to demonstrate how this process was going to work. So all VIPs that came to visit the Marines in Da Nang were taken out to see this demonstration. I call it a demonstration village, including Secretary McNamara. So we rehearsed that lift for several days. It was going to take four aircraft, and we were going to land in a dry rice paddy outside right at the edge of this village, with an easy walking distance up to the buildings. The rice paddy was small, it was tight. It was going to be really close getting those four aircraft into that one rice paddy. It required that the lead aircraft literally almost have the nose of the aircraft up against the paddy dike. If he didn't get far enough forward, you just wouldn't have room enough to get the other 3 aircraft into that paddy dike. So our squadron commander, who was just a wonderful guy, I'll never forget him, George Bauman. Big, tall, 6'4" guy, had flown A4 aircraft before that and flown Corsairs in Korea. So he's got the lead aircraft. So we come the day of the lift, and we pick up the secretary at the Da Nang Air Base and a whole entourage, and we go flying over to the demonstration village, and lo and behold, despite all of the rehearsals, Colonel Bauman did not get far enough forward in that rice paddy. I was flying the number 4 aircraft, so I'm the one that was really tight on space. So he come flying in there, and I could see immediately that he didn't get far enough forward, and there wasn't going to be any room in that rice paddy for me. So I came in approaching a hover, and I realized I was going to have to wave it off. And we had flown the secretary's aide, military aide, in earlier that day, and he was standing on the edge of the edge of the rice paddy, kind of trying to help us get into the space. And lo and behold, I came in and I had to wave off, and I waved off and went right over and blew him right off the rice paddy dike, right off the paddy dike into the rice paddy. Oh well. As they say, feces occurs. So it went on like that. And one of my other interesting missions on that first tour of duty in Vietnam was we had a lot of USO shows that came over. I got the honor and the privilege of being Anne Margaret's pilot for a day. Myself and a very good friend of mine who would later work for me and would later on become a lieutenant general in the Marine Corps. I got him a Norm Ehlert. He was going to be my co-pilot for the day. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, we picked up Anne Margaret at the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing headquarters at the air base at Da Nang. We were stationed by that time over at the Marble Mountain, Marine Corps' Marble Mountain Air Facility on the South China Sea, right on the beach, right behind the dune line. It was a great spot. So we picked her up. She had her entourage with her musical background and support, and she gave 3 performances that day. 3 performances. One at Da Nang for the Marines at Da Nang, and then we flew her north up to Wei Fu Bai, which was about 50 miles north. She put on another performance, and then we turned around and we flew her 100 miles south down to Chu Lai, where she put on a 3rd performance. And following that, she had dinner that night with the Marine commander in Vietnam, a guy by the name of Major General Louis Walt, at his headquarters, at his quarters actually, which are on top of a hill just to the west of the Da Nang Air Base. So at midnight, myself and my wingman are sitting up there on top of that mountain outside of General Walt's quarters, watching the clouds lower and lower, and wondering if we're going to be able to get off the mountain or everybody's going to spend the night up there. And by the time she came out of his quarters after having dinner and conversation with him, the clouds were literally down on top of the rotor blades. When he started up the helicopter, literally dove off of the landing pad at the Hill 327 and down there. But think about it, that day started at 7:30 in the morning and it finished at midnight. And she put on just a marvelous show. I mean, the troops loved it, and she was the most delightful person. And the interesting part about it, one of the more interesting parts about it, is that she had attended Northwestern University in Chicago. My friend Norm Ehlert, who was flying co-pilot with me, was from the south side of Chicago. and he had gone to Drake University in Iowa. So they had a great time sitting there. I'm flying the airplane. We got her in the jump seat behind us. Huey had a jump seat you could put in that was just behind the pilots and in between the two of them. With a good view forward. So we put her in that jump seat. Well, she smelled good too. She doused herself with perfume before each one of the stops and so forth. So they spent a good deal of that flight chatting with one another about Chicago, and she had dated a guy by the name of Mick Tingelhoff while she was in school, who wound up being an all-pro center for the Minnesota Vikings. And Norm had known him when he was in school as well. They were contemporaries. Anyway, that was one of the nicer missions that we flew. So, unlike what you've heard, war is not all shooting and killing. It has its bright moments. And I certainly had mine. With that first tour of duty over with, I went back to, I got orders back to Camp Pendleton, where we formed up a half-assed training squadron and spent the next 2 years training pilots and crews to go to Vietnam. I, by that time, had been asked to become the aircraft maintenance officer for that squadron. I was not trained in maintenance, but that, like many Marines, you're given a job to do, you do it whether you're trained for it or not, with greater or lesser success, and I was fortunate to have good people around me, so I had good success with it. But halfway through that, let's see, we were back at Camp Pendleton for a little over 2 years. And about halfway through that tour of duty, we found out the Marine Corps is going to get a new aircraft to go into its observation squadrons called the OV-10A Bronco, which was a twin turboprop high wing aircraft to be manned by a crew of 2, a pilot and a forward observer in the back seat of that aircraft. It had been termed in several places a light armed reconnaissance aircraft, a counterinsurgency aircraft, and was built with a lot of strange capabilities that had a little compartment in the back where you could literally carry some paratroopers if you had to put in a pioneer team to help establish a landing zone for a helicopter assault, or you could supposedly land on an unfinished roadway and pick up wounded. It could carry litters and so forth. I never flew it in any of those particular tasks. But in any case, the Marine Corps was going to take delivery of its production models at Camp Pendleton in what was that observation squadron training outfit that we had there. Myself, let's see, it would have been in late 1957, I guess. Myself, the maintenance officer, and our operations officer, a guy by the name of Cy Kittler, were the first pilots that were going to be trained, the first fleet pilots that were going to be trained to fly that airplane. So we went to Columbus, Ohio, to North American's factory, and in November of 1967, we went through a ground school conducted by North American Aviation, a couple of Marines and about 5 Air Force pilots, because the Air Force was slated to take the OV-10 in and become its it's in-country a forward air control airplane for the stuff they were doing in Laos and Cambodia. In any case, from there we went to Patuxent River, Maryland, where a multi-service evaluation group was evaluating the aircraft for the use in the various services. And of course, being a naval aircraft, that's where the OV-10 had gone through all of its test and evaluation before it was accepted. As a matter of fact, my interviewer over here was the guy who took that aircraft through a lot of that testing at Pax River back in 67 and 66, 67, I guess. So once we finished that ground school in Columbus, Ohio, we went to Cy Kittler and I went to Patuxent River, where we checked out in the prototypes that were there. Flew them for about a month and then went back to Camp Pendleton and waited for the production models to come out of the aircraft, which we started taking delivery of them early in 1968. So at one point or another, we've got this group of H-1 helicopters, and now we're getting this group of OV-10A Broncos. And our squadron, if you will, at Camp Pendleton was getting larger and larger. At one point became the largest helicopter, the largest aircraft squadron in the Marine Corps. Our maintenance department grew to over 600 people, and we had 44 aircraft on station. A mixture of UH-1s and OV-10 Broncos, which was great flying because I get to fly helicopters or I get to fly this other toy every day. So that was pretty enjoyable there for a while. And then we eventually started to send out cadres of OV-10s along with our UH-1 trained pilots over to Vietnam, the same as had occurred with me when I originally went over there in 1965. So I went back to Vietnam in late fall, November of 1968, and spent another year over there. Came back from that second tour in Vietnam in November of 1969 with orders to the Naval Amphibious School at Little Creek, Virginia. You know, you have to stop and think about this. In 1964, Gloria and I moved from New York City to California. In 1965, I went to Vietnam. Gloria went to Pensacola to spend the year. Her mother was in there in Pensacola, and so she would have that kind of support. Plus, her mother could enjoy her grandkids. The next, I come back from Vietnam a year later. I have to go back to Pensacola and pick up Gloria. Go back to California. And 2 years later, I go back to Vietnam and move Gloria back to Pensacola. A year later, I come back from Vietnam to Waters, California, go back to Pensacola and pick up Gloria and go cross country. We used to say that we were commuters from Pensacola, Florida to Camp Pendleton, California for the better part of 7 years. So that was a lot of cross-country driving. I got to tell you one story about her that was interesting. When I came back from Vietnam the first time, went to Pensacola, and we bought a brand new car. It was a two-door sedan, Chrysler Import. Had a 480 cubic inch engine in it, and it was really a nice road car. So we're driving to California. So we stopped overnight someplace in Texas. Probably stopped 3 days in Texas because it's 1,000 miles to cross Texas when you're driving, and you enter Beaumont on the east side and exit El Paso on the west. So we get up one morning and she's gonna we always alternated driving. We still do. We'll drive an hour or hour and a half or 2 hours. We'll stop and switch driving. So she's driving. I'm sitting over there and I'm reading a newspaper. And I'm driving along and something didn't sound right. So there was too much wind noise in that car. I look over and she's doing 95 miles an hour down. There were no interstates across Texas in those days, but Texas had always had great roads, nice, big, wide, two-lane roads with lots of shoulders and what else have you, and there was no traffic on the roads in 1966. And she's got the pedal to the metal, and she's just driving along at 95 miles an hour. He said, you might want to slow down just a little bit. Texas police were very liberal in their road. They used to not have a speed limit. They used to have something called reasonable and proper. I said in 95 I thought was probably a little beyond the reasonable range. Anyway, she was a great driver, still is, probably better than me. But in any case. Let's see, where was I? We're going back to, I'm coming back, I've come back from my second tour in Vietnam with orders to the Naval Amphibious School at Little Creek, Virginia, where I figured I'm going to take over their air support section with a couple of Navy lieutenant commanders, and I'm going to teach air support of amphibious operations for the next 3 years. Well, we bought our first house in Virginia Beach. Beautiful, really brand new house, just lovely. We thought, well, we're going to be here for 3 years. We'll take a fling at owning a home. So we bought the house in December of 1969, and in January of 1969, I come out on the list for graduate school. So in August of 1969, we move again. We go to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. Here it is. I've got this Southern bride. She did practice living in the winter up north by going to New Jersey for a couple of years with us when we were in New York City. But Madison, Wisconsin is something different, and let me tell you, that's some harsh winters. Anyway, so we moved to Madison, Wisconsin, and we take up living spaces in government quarters of all places. During the height of the Cold War, when we were concerned about Russians sending missiles and aircraft across the North Pole and into North America, we set up the U.S. set up the North American Air Defense Command, which included putting in fighter interceptor aircraft at air bases along the northern tier of the U.S. Well, we didn't have air bases up there in those days. So what they did is that the Air Force would go in and they'd set up operations at a civilian airfield. And when they did that, they would build a set of quarters. And in Madison, Wisconsin, the Air Force was sharing the Truex Field with commercial operations. They built a set of quarters out there in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, which was about 10 miles outside of town. And by the time we got there in 1969, that air operation had been closed up, and the quarters had all been closed, except for all the officers' quarters. They had 120 sets of officers' quarters. They closed all the enlisted quarters and made the officers' quarters available to any military, active duty military who were in the Madison area, which included things like regular forces serving with the reserves, included the ROTC staffs, the ROTC, and graduate students at the University of Wisconsin. So we got to live in one of those government quarters for the 2 years that we were there at the University of Wisconsin, which was that was interesting. That was fun. Wonderful school. I want to say that. Great school. And I was there majoring in journalism and mass communications, getting ready to fill a public affairs billet. I knew not where. Could have been anywhere in the world at that point where Marine Corps had major commands. It turned out that my orders were to headquarters of the Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. So I spent about a year and a half there at Madison, got a master's degree, which I thank the Marine Corps for, because after I had retired, that education that I got me every job that I had from there on until I fully retired. A little aside there. So I left Madison, Wisconsin in March of 1970. Gloria stayed behind for another couple of months until our kids got through school that year, and then we moved to West Springfield, Virginia, where we spent the next 10 years. My tour at Headquarters Marine Corps was a very rewarding one in the Division of Information. I served with some really good people. One of the directors of information, a Marine Brigadier General by the name of Bill Maloney, I had known for years. He was actually a commanding officer of VMO 6 in Vietnam. I didn't serve with him there, but I had flown with him previously, and he was just a wonderful person. Went on to become a 3-star, and we lost him within the last year. So, anyway, 4 years at Headquarters Marine Corps in the Division of Information, and I've reached a point where my next assignment was likely to be out of that tour of duty at Headquarters. My next assignment was going to be my 4th unaccompanied overseas tour, and both of our sons had gotten to the point where they were teenagers at that point, and I figured they needed me around more than the Marine Corps needed me, so I decided to retire. Now Gloria, on the other hand, she wasn't ready to retire. She just as soon I stayed in. But in any case, we decided that we would retire, and retire from the Marine Corps we did. But because I had that degree in journalism, the billet that I had at the Division of Information at headquarters included as an additional duty, serving on the editorial board of the Marine Corps' professional journal, the Marine Corps Gazette. I had worked my way into the good graces of that organization, so I had a job waiting. I had a job waiting for me when I retired as the editor of the Marine Corps Gazette. I went down to Quantico and spent the next 4 years commuting in reverse from Northern Virginia to Quantico rather than from Quantico to Washington, D.C. I enjoyed that job very much. Enjoyed the work. Kept me in with the Marine Corps. I met more people on that job in the Marine Corps than I did in all my 20 years of active duty, because I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. at headquarters, Marine Corps, and around, meeting people, interviewing people, what else have you for the duties of the magazine. But I finally reached a point when I said to myself, I got to find out if I can exist in the outside world without this, rather than in this halfway house that I'm in as the editor of the Marine Corps Gazette. So I resigned that job and then went into Washington, D.C. and spent 2 years working for one of the Big 8 accounting firms. It was called Pete Marwick Mitchell and co-partners in those days, and is now called KPMG. You'll see it on Phil Mickelson's, the golfer's cap. KPMG is one of Mickelson's sponsors on the professional golf tour. So I spent 2 years there, and then the Reagan administration came in, and the whole nature of consulting in Washington, D.C. changed from what it had been under the Carter administration. A lot of emphasis on housing and education and so forth, and the shift immediately went to defense. Well, it took the big consulting firms in Washington a little time to shift gears. In the meantime, I became surplus at Pete Marwick Mitchell, and they said, we're going to have to let you go. So I started, for the first time in my life, I was going to be unemployed, which was a kind of a scary situation, but we managed, and lo and behold, I started putting out resumes, and I get a telephone call from a lieutenant colonel by the name of, get this guy's name, Lundy Sheritz. He's a lieutenant colonel, and he's in Orlando, Florida, with the Naval, what would be the Naval Training Systems Center. It wasn't called that in those days, but it was the agency that assisted the procurement of training devices and simulators for the Navy, departments of the Navy and the Army. And he said, we're forming up a team down here to develop a series of war games for the Marine Corps. Would you be interested in doing something like that? And I said, well, I'm unemployed. I'm interested in doing anything. But he said, I'm going to be in Washington next week. Could you meet me and let's talk about it a little bit more? I said, sure. So I did. Met him in Springfield, Virginia. We chatted, and he invited me down to Orlando, Florida, to take a look at their operation. So I went down there and spent about 3 days talking with people, and went back home and told Gloria, I said, they're offering us a job. It's as an independent contractor to work on this War Games project. What do you think? She said, well, what do you think? It's up to you. You're the guy that's going to be doing it. I said, yeah, but you're the one who's going to need the bread that we're going to make, that we're going to buy with the money we're going to make on that thing, and there's no guarantee that's going to last very long. So she said, well, why don't you take that part-time offer that they're giving you and go down there and see what it's like. So I did. And after being down in Orlando for a while, I called her up and I said, well, this thing looks like it's pretty good. It's an interesting job, and I think it's going to have some longevity to it. It was working technically as an independent contractor for the University of Central Florida, which in those days had a student body of about 2,500 people. But their division of sponsored research was the one that had the contract to develop this series of manual war game-based training systems for the Marines. Incidentally, the University of Central Florida is now the largest university in the country, with more than 70,000 students. So it grew a little bit. I had nothing to do with that. So we signed another contract with the University of Central Florida, and we moved again. We moved down to Florida. By that time, Greg was out of school. Greg had gone on to the University of Maryland on a football scholarship. I played football for Jerry Claiborne at Maryland for 2 years, and then got injured and could no longer play football. Decided he didn't want to be in college. He was not interested in education. He was interested in playing football. When he couldn't play football, he didn't want to be in college anymore. So he dropped out of school and went on and got a associate's degree in police science, and became a police officer with Fairfax County, Virginia, which he did for 25 years. Following that, he went down to Charleston, South Carolina, where he worked for the Charleston Police Department in establishing an intelligence unit, and then finally retired from all forms of, he said, I've had enough of law enforcement, I'm done with it. And he retired and fulfilled his life's dream and moved to Tampa, Florida. So he's down in Florida. He was born in Pensacola with the sand in his shoes, and he's in Tampa, Florida with the sand in his shoes. So, our younger son, Mike, he was the one who was interested in education. He was in Richmond. He went to three colleges to get his bachelor's degree. He started at James Madison University and out there in Harrisonburg, Virginia. He was there for about a year. Gloria and I had moved to Florida by that time, because I had just taken that consulting job, if you will, with University of Central Florida in the War Games business. So he came down to Florida with us, and he enrolled in the University of Central Florida, and he spent a year and a half there, and then he met a girl from Virginia. So he said, I think I'm going to go back to Richmond. So he did. He moved back to Virginia, went to Virginia Commonwealth University and got his bachelor's degree. the girl that attracted him in Virginia was long gone by then. But then Mike decided that after getting his degree in criminal justice from James Madison, or from Virginia Commonwealth University, that he wanted to go to law school. In the meantime, he got married, and he's still married to Dana. So he went to law school at the University of South Carolina. And by the time they got down to South Carolina, Gloria and I had moved another couple of times, and we were here in Williamsburg, Virginia. We thought we had retired finally. We thought this was going to be our retirement spot. And we had been here about 4 years by that time. And Mike says, "Oh, Mom, Dad, why don't you come on down to South Carolina, be with us?" I said, "Mike, you've been through law school, you've been through," oh, I'm ahead of my story. He went on to, after law school, he decided he didn't want to be a lawyer. He wanted to go into academia. So he decides he's going to go get a PhD, enrolled in Arizona State University. Mike finishes his degree, goes and teaches a couple of places, and winds up coming back to University of South Carolina, not to the law school, but to their Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And he says, "Oh, Mom, Dad, why don't you move down here?" And I said, "Mike, you move as much as we did in the military. You're not going to stay in one place." He said, "Oh, yes, I am. Yeah, I'm going to stay here until the kids are through high school." Anyway, they had 2 children by that time, Mitchell and Abigail. So again, we drank that Kool-Aid, and we moved to Chapin, South Carolina, and we stayed down there for 5 years, and those were a really nice 5 years. We moved into a subdivision, a street away from where Mike and Dana and the kids were living, and we just enjoyed living in that area for those 5 years. And then, of course, he does the inevitable thing. He takes a new job. Besides, he just takes a job as dean of the largest college at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia. So they moved to Georgia, and Gloria and I looked at one another and said, "We are not going to follow these kids. And particularly, we're not going to Statesboro, Georgia. I can assure you of that." So I said, "Well, where are we going to go?" "Well, why don't we go to North Carolina? We'll go out there now I'm ahead of my story again. We had moved to Williamsburg, Virginia after we retired, and we were in Florida. We decided we'd had enough after 15 years in Central Florida of the heat. The heat gets intolerable in Florida after a while. So we moved back to Virginia. And we were living in a little place called Goode, Virginia, out near Lynchburg, out near the mountains. We built a house on a acreage lot out there, and we were there for about 4 years. And Gloria had enough by that time of the cows and the corn, so it was a little bit too rural for her. So we moved to Williamsburg, and we bought a home over in Waterford. In Powhatan Secondary off Monticello Avenue, and we were there for about 4 years. And we went from there to, I mean, we've been to so many places, I can't keep track of them after a while. Where did we go from there?
You have it on there. So when did you come to Williamsburg for the final move?
We came to Williamsburg for the final time a little over a year ago. We had, when we were living and working in Central Florida, in the years that, in the Orlando area, we started receiving marketing information from Patriots Colony in the late 90s, right after they started in the business here. And he said, and coincidentally, Gloria's mother, by that time, was retired herself and was living in a CCRC called Azalea Trace in Pensacola. And she lived there for 10 years. So we got really well acquainted with the whole CCRC thing. And said, this sounds like something we might be interested in doing ourselves sometime in the future. So we got knowledgeable about that, and in the meantime, we're getting this marketing information from Patriots Colony, and we moved back to Virginia. So we're living out there in the mountains, and we started visiting this place over time. We probably stayed in every one of those 4 apartment motel rooms over there, or in this building, multiple times, because we visited this place a lot over the years. And then we continued to move and wound up after Mike left South Carolina and decided he was going to go to Statesboro, Georgia, and we're at the decision point, where are we going to go? So I said, well, how about the Hendersonville, North Carolina area, which we knew very well. It was out near the mountains. We enjoyed the mountains. We owned a timeshare in the mountains of North Carolina for years. We knew the area. We knew it would be cheaper than trying to move back here to Williamsburg. So we went out there and we built a new house in Flat Rock, North Carolina. After 4 years, we moved to Hendersonville, North Carolina, and we thought we were in pretty good shape there. And then I came down with a strange liver ailment called primary sclerosing cholangitis, which is very rare and eventually can be fatal, but it's not something that's going to kill you right away. So Gloria says, she says, if you're going to die on me, she says, I don't want to be left out here in the mountains of North Carolina. I mean, we've got wonderful friends here, but I have no attachment to this place. So I said, well, this may be the ideal time to consider going to Patriots Colony, because we're all set up physically, location, with where we can go from transition from independent living into assisted living and into healthcare, nursing home, when and if it's needed. And I said, that's the ideal setup. That's why we're interested in these places in the first place. She said, yeah, okay. So here we are. And the reason we were able to get in here at this time was because of the new apartments that they built and became ready for occupancy back in June of last year. Yes. And interesting enough, we sold our house in North Carolina very quickly and very easily, much more easily than we expected to. Got a contract on it in September of the previous year. We weren't going to move until May, when these buildings were supposed to be complete. Well, May comes along and our buyer wants to move into our house, and these aren't ready. So we became homeless for the 3 months of the summer. So we rented over in Kingsville for a couple of months, and then we took a month and we went out to visit our younger son and Mike and Dana, who's by that time, after 3 or 4 other intermediate stops, is in San Antonio, Texas, where he heads the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Texas in San Antonio. We visited them and then went on to Denver, Colorado, where our older granddaughter, Greg's only child, had finished college in James Madison University in Virginia and gone to Denver and never came back. She met a guy out there, she got married, and they now have presented us with our first 2 great-grandchildren. So we went out, she only had 1 at the time a year ago. So we went out to meet Olivia for the first time. So. And then we came back and stayed with Gloria's sister, who had a military career of her own. She had been married to a Navy pilot for a number of years, but had been living in Virginia Beach for 40 years at this point. So we spent a couple of weeks with her, and eventually were able to move in here to Patriots Pavilion. Is that what it's called? Patriots Pavilion?
Presidents.
President's Pavilion, not
Yeah.
the President's Pavilion. In the end of August of last year. We've been here ever since. Delightful.